Make it a movie.
Alright, bet.
何としてでも勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
So before we start this video off, I would like to say, you guys go into the comments, and basically all I really have to say for this part of the video is, like, I would like to thank Neptune, of course, for their help in this project, and basically just helping with some of the plot points for this. Well, a good amount of the plot points. And with that being said, they do have a channel. I will link it in the description. Now let's get on with the video. Now, when it came on to Izuku, he would have actually discovered his quirk at the age of 4, like most kids. He would have ended up finding himself shooting webs out of his hands one day. It wouldn't only be this though, but his hands would be sticking to the wall for some reason. Inko would witness Izuku's anguish and immediately take him to the doctor, of course after getting his hands unstuck. While at the doctor, Izuku would get an examination. After said examination, the doctor would come out with a report. This report being that Izuku seemingly had a mix of an emitter and mutation type quirk. Basically, when it came onto Izuku's quirk, it was sort of like a spider physiology quirk. One of the features of the quirk the doctor observed was that Izuku seemingly had talons. So they would end up They basically suggest that Izuku start wearing gloves from now on in order to avoid the risk of hurting someone on accident. Of course, Inko had also seen Izuku shoot webs from his hands and actually stick to walls. The doctor had mentioned the part about the possibility of Izuku being able to climb walls with that sort of quirk. Izuku would hear all of this and actually get a bit excited. He had a quirk after all, that meant he could be a hero. Izuku would also find out later though, during the day, that his vision had seemingly become even stronger than usual, because of the fact that the sun was noticeably brighter, and blindingly bright in all honesty. It was getting concerning for Izuku. His head would start to spin a little, and Inko would basically give him her pair of shades to wear for the time being. This would actually calm Izuku down. Inko would realize that Izuku also needed to have shades to wear from now on, basically in order to just get around with daily life, you could say. It seemed that Izuku had enhanced vision on top of the other parts of his quirk. Well, no one ever said that raising a kid would be easy. The next day, kids would actually question what sort of quirk Izuku had and what was with his new getup, considering the fact that he was now wearing gloves and a pair of shades, especially inside of all places. What did he think he was, like the new cool guy or something? Izuku would explain how his quirk was modeled after a spider, in where he had talons, hence the gloves, he could shoot webs, and he had enhanced vision. It also seems that his hearing got better as well. Izuku were trying to show the webbing aspect of his quirk once he took off one of his gloves, revealing the talons, but he kinda sucked at using it. Some of the kids would find it to be pretty cool, but more would be interested in Bakugo's quirk because, well, it was very flashy. Explosions were always just cool to people, especially if you're one of those people who wishes just set off an explosion, and you wouldn't even look back to see it. And they watched a lot of movies, after all. A lot of old movies, you could say. But over the years, Izuku would show himself to be one of the most capable kids within his school, though. Within each of his classes, he would actually find himself being able to lift an incredible amount, more than most of the kids within his school. And it didn't seem to be like something that he could just turn on and off either. It was more so that Izuku would have to hold back in order to live somewhat normally, because of the fact that, well, he didn't have some sort of emitter type super strength quirk where he could just turn it on and off like it was a light switch. No, Izuku always had his super strength on. He always had his enhanced hearing and vision on. He always had each parts of his quirk on at all times, but Izuku would learn to get the hang of it. He would actually begin to get quite a bit of attention from the other kids within his school, thanks to said capabilities. Izuku would even find himself being able to run faster too, though. At one point, kids would even see Izuku climbing walls and ceilings, and they would begin to take pictures, finding it to be so cool. Many would think Izuku had quite an awesome quirk. It would even get Bakugo's attention after all of this. With all of the attention garnered around Izuku, Bakugo would challenge Izuku to a fight from time to time. But Izuku recognized what sort of quirk Bakugo had. He realized he would be at a disadvantage if he ever tried to actually fight Bakugo. So he would try to avoid conflict with the boy each and every time. He could tell a losing battle when he saw one, after all. The only way Izuku would really be able to fight Bakugo would be if he blindfolded himself. That would be the only way he could actually probably survive with simply a minor headache. The boys would respect each other for their individual strengths, though. Bakugo would just be annoyed most of the time that Izuku would refuse to fight him. Bakugo, when hearing that Izuku also planned on going to UA one day, would actually be intrigued. In his eyes, Izuku was another stepping stone in his path to become the #1 hero. So he didn't mind that Izuku was also going to UA, since it would mean Bakugo would continue to have more drive to surpass everyone there. And Izuku was, well, what you could say, probably cut from a different cloth compared to the other kids within this school. When it came on to the sludge villain incident, though, Izuku would simply be too swift for the sludge villain to catch. The sludge villain, they would end up getting captured by All Might per usual, and this time he wouldn't be able to slip out of All Might's pocket, because, well, Izuku never ground onto All Might's leg in this version of events. Instead, All Might would just simply take the villain to the police. Izuku would spend his time for the next 10 months training as his way of preparing for the entrance exams. Once the entrance exams had begun, basically once the 10 months were over with and the entrance exams were here, Izuku would actually sit by Bakugo for the beginning of it. When hearing President Mike's lecture, he wouldn't actually mutter. No. Instead, he would just sit calmly listening in. Izuku's enhanced hearing did make President Mike a bit more louder, though it could be annoying at times. But Izuku would still keep attentive most of the time. When it came on to the physical portion of the exams, Izuku would actually be one of the very first people to enter through the gate. The people there would call Izuku out until they heard President Mike say, "You guys should probably be following that kid. There's really no countdowns in and a battle against villains. You guys need to hurry up and go through the gate now. Realizing this, the other kids would envy Izuku. They would actually be quite annoyed, but they would run in just as well. And Izuku would have already started catching a lot of points. Although, to be honest, Izuku was rather sloppy with his webs, but he was still somewhat effective with them. He would use his webs in order to force some robots to collide with each other. He would punch through some of the other robots as well. Izuku would end up also going to save Ochako by lifting up the rebel that was trapping her ankle once time was starting to run out. He would even pick her up and carry her away from the 0-point robots as fast as he could. After all of this, Izuku would actually make it into the hero course with 50 hero points and 20 rescue points. Basically, he would have gotten 70 points overall, which was actually quite a bit. Izuku, on the first day at UA, he would actually hear Bakugo and Ida bickering. Izuku, he would just simply sigh and try to cover his ears. He really didn't want to hear this on the first day. But a girl with short brown hair, they would actually tap his shoulder. Izuku would turn around and only to see that it was Ochako, the girl that he had saved the last time. Ochako would of course recognize Izuku from the hair, and she would have actually thanked him for saving her back there at the entrance exam. Ida would notice this and actually walk over to Izuku, wanting to compliment him for his heroic ways during the entrance exams too. They would all be interrupted though by a tired-looking man with shaggy black hair. He looked very drained, looked like he had gone like 4 days without sleep. The kids would be wondering who this guy was until he informed them of the fact that his name was Aizawa, and that he was apparently their teacher for Class 1A. They'd also find out from the man that they would be doing some sort of quirk examination. When hearing from one of the students that it seemed like it was going to be fun, Aizawa would get serious. He would threaten whoever made last place with expulsion since they said it seemed like fun. This wasn't meant to be fun. No, it was meant to actually get an examination of just how strong these kids were and basically getting some sort of numbers for what needs to be worked on from here on out. Basically, basically what you would give to students for like their very first day, or like their first exam, you could say. In order to see what sort of progress they would need to make in order to become good heroes later on. The kids would be forced to try their absolute hardest because of said threat. Izuku would actually get some pretty impressive scores throughout all of this, and even use his webs at one point to build up momentum. He'd use the built up momentum in order to throw a ball, or like a softball, in order to get a high score in the ball throw. He would have gotten around the 700 meters range for the ball throw. This would actually impress some of the students as well. As far as the grip strength test would go, Izuku would actually crush it, which would surprise pretty much everybody there, even Shoji, because of the fact that Izuku didn't really look to be all that much in the physical department. In the end, Izuku would actually manage to get top 5 for the quick exams, and Mineta would have actually ended up being in last place. Mineta would be told to pack his bags. He was being expelled. Well, not really expelled, more so just removed from the hero course, because in Aizawa's eyes, Mineta seemingly had no potential. He would be moved down to the general course. That was the only act of mercy that Aizawa was going to give Mineta. Momo would be the most shocked out of everyone though, believing that everything that Aizawa was saying in the beginning was just a simple logical ruse. But no, it apparently wasn't at all. The Kings would be more nervous about UA from here on out. Hearing that All Might would be teaching them one day, though, would get them somewhat excited. They would still be nerve-wracked over the whole expulsion of one of their former classmates on the first day, though. They would be worried that another one of them could actually get expelled, but this time by All Might, which would hurt even more, because of the fact that they were basically being judged by the number one hero as not being worthy enough to be a hero, to be part of such a prestigious school. All Might would relieve their worries though by explaining that there would be no expulsions during his lesson, or well, demotions you could say. Everyone would sigh in relief, and they would immediately dress up in their hero costumes. When it came onto Izuku's costume, he would actually take some inspiration from a comic book hero. They had similar powers to himself, where they basically had spider powers. They were able to shoot webs, although his were not necessarily organic. They were also able to climb walls. They had super strength, super speed. They didn't necessarily have the enhanced hearing and vision that Izuku had, which ended up giving him problems from time to time, but instead of having that, he had what they called spider sense, which Izuku could totally have seen as really convenient to have. It would have been really great to have back then, but what could you do? He would have basically modeled this suit from that comic book hero, but he would have remodeled it to have it where it was more futuristic. It would have had a more futuristic look to it, and it would essentially be the costume you all see on the thumbnail. For the heroes versus villains exercise, Izuku would end up being paired with Ochako. Unfortunately, Izuku, he would have to face Bakugo and Oyama during this match. Izuku would have had his costume designed to have built-in shades. For, well, obvious reasons. He did not necessarily want to go onto the fighting scene having to strain his eyes so often. But when it came on to fighting a living firecracker, Izuku doubted that these shades would really be all that effective here. Bakugo, though, he would be excited to finally fight Izuku after the boy had been avoiding fights from him for so long now. He would finally get a gauge for Izuku's strength. He would make sure that Oyama would not interfere in their fight here. Oyama would be watching over the bomb instead. Izuku would do his best in order to avoid facing Bakugo, though. He would instead be climbing the walls, hoping to find another way in order to get to the bomb. He didn't want to face Bakugo here, not whatsoever. Izuku would make his way to the top of the building, looking through windows for each part, until he eventually found the bomb right by a window. He would actually climb through that window and find the bomb actually being guarded by Aoyama. Izuku would quickly web up the French boy's eyes, obscuring his vision. There, Izuku would actually go on to try and touch the bomb, but he would get stumped by an angry Bakugo who would send explosions towards Izuku's face. Izuku's eyes would have been irritated from the sudden bright light, but he would try to push through it. Izuku would try to avoid Bakugo's attacks and communicate with Ochako through his intercom in order to tell her where the bomb was. He was hoping that she would be able to at least touch it herself. The longer the fight between himself and Bakugo went, the more Izuku's eyes would actually begin to get messed up from the bright light Bakugo's explosions produced. Mixed in with Aoyama's laser cannon once he managed to rip off Izuku's webbing, and well, it would have been a nightmare for Izuku. Basically, it was a combined attack from Bakugo and Aoyama that would eventually push Izuku over the edge. The amount of bright light was just overwhelming at this point. A blood-curdling scream would be heard from Izuku, which would alarm All Might and the two other boys. They would be wondering what was wrong with Izuku. All Might, looking through Izuku's files, would realize the situation, and he would try to take Izuku out of there immediately. Izuku's head would be pounding and his vision going in and out. All Might would call the match off right then and there. The students, even including Bakugo, they would all be concerned for Izuku. Ochako would go to check up on Izuku after the match had been cancelled. Izuku would be found within Recovery Girl's office. Recovery Girl would have healed Izuku, but his eyes were still a bit wonky from that fight. Izuku would end up spending the rest of the day within Recovery Girl's office, just having his eyes take a break for the day. The next day, Aizawa would bring up how everyone did during their training with All Might. He would bring up Izuku's fight and mention how he was pretty much just given a bad matchup overall. It would be best for Izuku to overcome that weakness though, since it could serve as even more of a hindrance later on. Izuku would take those words to heart. And Aizawa would go on to actually mention how they needed to pick a class president. In the end, they would choose Ida as class rep, with Momo being his vice rep. Izuku and Ochako would actually congratulate Ida at the lunch table. As far as the news reporters breaking in would go, Ida would still rise to the occasion and calm everyone down. The USJ would be a very different story though. People would be questioning how Izuku's quirk worked due to the many different aspects that he showed during the quirk exams and the hero vs villains exercise. Izuku would explain how he had spider abilities as a quirk. He had hypersensitive vision though, meaning that bright flashing lights could actually disorient him. I would use I would mention Pokemon for example, but you guys probably know the story. If not, just look up Pokemon Band episodes. You guys will basically get the reference from there, and Izuku would explain that's basically how it kinda is for him. If the light is too bright and it's splashing at the same time, it could really mess him up. And considering what ended up happening to him against his fight with Bakugo, which is why he tries to avoid fights with him of all people. The kids would honestly feel bad for Izuku there. He had a pretty amazing quirk, but it was a double-edged blade, or like a double-edged sword. Once they reached the USJ though, they would end up finding villains raiding the place. Izuku would be one of the few capable of avoiding getting teleported by Kurogiri. Izuku would try to help Aizawa take down the villains there, but he would honestly kind of struggle. Not necessarily struggle to take them down, but more so against one villain in particular that was rather dangerous. This man was wearing hands all over his body, and just looking at his quirk, he could tell that this man was dangerous. This man was able to decay people, for crying out loud, with just a touch from his hand. Seemingly he needed to have all 5 fingers on a person in order to start decaying them, which was why Izuku was finding this man to be incredibly risky. He would actually be able to avoid Shigaraki's attacks for the most part, thanks to his agility. He was too fast and agile for Shigaraki to grab, but Izuku would actually try and go in for a punch. This punch would only be intercepted by the Nomu though. They would block the attack, and Izuku would realize that the Nomu showed no sort of emotion when it came onto that attack either. It was as if the attack did absolutely nothing to the Nomu. It confused Izuku for a bit because of the fact that most of the time, Izuku's attacks, they usually hurt. And so this was the first time Izuku actually had to deal with somebody who was able to just tank an attack from him like that. Izuku would end up getting into an altercation with the Nomu from there on. Izuku would be forced to use his full strength throughout this fight, but his punches would show little to no effect against the Nomu though. All it really seemed to do was push him back a bit. The Nomu, he could tell, held heavy punches, but he would avoid most of them. The Nomu was fast, but their movements were basic. Izuku had the agility to avoid these attacks. He would hold out long enough in order for All Might to make his way to USJ. There, All Might would take over the fight between the Nomu, and Izuku would be able to calm down from there on. Shigaraki would try to fight Izuku, but bullets would shoot through the man-child's kneecaps and hands. Other heroes would have arrived at the scene, forcing for Shigaraki and Kurogiri to retreat. Kent would be relieved to see the heroes, especially All Might, here, but they would recognize that he wasn't smiling. Izuku would end up seeing All Might fight the Nomu, and thanks to his enhanced vision, he would actually see, well, All Might bleeding at one point. He would wonder why that was the case. He wondered if the Nomu was really that strong, and if so, just how many more of these things were out there. But the next worry would be the sports festival. Aizawa, though covered in bandages, would actually still enter the classroom. He would inform everybody about the fact that the sports festival was coming up, and despite there being an incident at the USJ, the principal of UA, Nezu, wanted to show the media that UA was still capable of protecting their kids, and that their principal wanted to show just how strong the kids actually were. They would have used this whole thing with the villains as basically some sort of way in order to boost their credibility, showing that, hey, our kids were able to fight off real villains, so you should already know that our kids are actually going to be fully capable of handling themselves later on. This is just a glimpse of what they're going to be capable of in the future. The kids would still be skeptical about this, thinking that they still deserve a break from all of this, that the USJ should have been cancelled, but there wasn't much that they could really do. They would just have to work as hard as possible in order to keep their spots within Class 1A and show themselves to be fully capable to the heroes that will be watching. Other students would end up surrounding 1A's door once they found out that they fought off real villains and that the USJ, but the sports festival would be happening soon. Bakugo would point out how these kids were just here to scope out the competition, and he would shove his way through. Izuku wouldn't realize it, but All Might would actually begin to show interest in the boy, thanks to Izuku having actually, trying to fight off the Nomu. Basically, All Might would have been impressed at the fact that Izuku was able to avoid attacks from the Nomu back at the USJ, so that would have caught All Might's interest. And he had noticed how the boy fought back when he was just doing a simple lesson plan. basically a heroes versus villains exercise. Despite Izuku being at a severe disadvantage thanks to his hypersensitive vision, he still tried to fight Bakugo and Aoyama, which would really show Izuku's credibility as a hero. He was willing to push against the obstacles ahead of him. Even if he was at a severe disadvantage, he wouldn't really call it quits right then and there, so he admired Izuku for that. On the day of the sports festival, Izuku would end up face-palming at what was basically Bakugo's declaration of war onto all of the students at UA. Izuku would just try to do his best in the race. Izuku would be able to web sling through the robots, avoiding having to deal with an actual altercation against said robots. Using the momentum, he would actually fly through the air, completely avoiding the second part of the obstacle course. Izuku would have to deal with the bomb section of the exam though. Bakugo and Todoroki would be toe-and-toe with Izuku at this point. Izuku would shoot a web at Bakugo's leg though, when realizing how close Bakugo was, and he would web sling to the exit, which would greatly annoy Bakugo. He would burst out laughing though when he saw Izuku miss the target just by a bit though, and see Izuku slam into the wall. Izuku would have groaned from the pain, but he would get back up and walk through the exit. Izuku would just barely get first place in that section of the sports festival. Izuku would be awarded 10 million points for getting first place there, and he would be forced to rally up a team. This team would consist of himself, Ochako, Hatsume, and Tokuyami. Izuku would do his best in order to fend off his opponents during the second part of the sports festival. He would snatch some headbands as well, but he would end up having to also deal with Bakugo and Todoroki. In all honesty, Izuku was trying to avoid getting into an altercation with those two boys, considering what he had heard about Todoroki and how much he knew about Bakugo. Izuku would eventually be cornered by Todoroki though. Izuku would begin to panic though, and he would punch through some of Todoroki's ice. Todoroki would see this and be surprised. He didn't realize that Izuku was that strong to just be able to punch through his ice like that. Izuku would focus his attention on trying to escape, but in the end Ida would have been the one to help Todoroki get first place in this part of the sports festival. Izuku would have gotten third place in the end, thanks to him actually having taken some headbands, but in the end, well, when it came on to the amount of headbands, he wasn't all that concerned with getting a whole lot. His main concern was just trying to protect his one and only 10 million head point band. So of course, that's why he would have ended up in third place. As far as tournament part of the sports festival would go, Izuku would match up against the one known as Hitoshi Shinso. Hearing why Ojiro decided to drop out of the tournament and what happened when he talked to Shinso would make Izuku hesitant of talking to the purple-haired boy when dealing with the insomniac. Rather than communicating with him, Izuku would web his mouth shut, which would irritate Shinso. When dealing with most opponents, Shinso would basically try to mock them, basically try and get a response out of them. But this kid was clever. He literally just used his quirk in order to avoid having to actually talk to him. Izuku would rush at the boy and knock him out to the ring right after. His next match would be against Todoroki, and there he would basically be trying to constantly freeze Izuku. Izuku would have already prepared for this part though. He would be too agile for Todoroki's ice most of the time. He would avoid most of the attacks, and with some of the ice, Izuku would simply end up destroying them with his physical strength. Azuka would realize later on in the fight, though, that ancient Todoroki's attacks were getting slower. He would take advantage of this and get closer to Todoroki. Todoroki would have been overusing his eyesight at this point. He was tempted to use his fire just this once, but he would refuse to give his father the pleasure of seeing such a thing. In the end, though, Todoroki would lose to Azuku. Azuku would move on to the fight against Ida, and he would also knock him out accordingly. Azuku's last match would be against Bakugo. Bakugo's explosions, they were the biggest issue for Azuku in the end, and Azuku wouldn't be capable of withstanding the bright lights the explosions produced. Azuku would feel excruciating pain from said lights and collapse to the floor. A massive headache would consume Azuku. Azuku would scream once more before collapsing. Once Bakugo ended up using Howitzer Impact, it was basically a done deal from there. Bakugo would understand the weakness of Azuku and see this as a simply bad matchup in general. But Bakugo would gracefully take first place this time around. There would have been no aggression coming from him. He would have realized that Azuku did try his best, but it's just that he wasn't able to take on the bright light that Bakugo's explosions produced. Azuku would have gotten second place, and despite getting second place, he would still get quite a bit of offers. He would get many offers from pro heroes here. While going through the options, All Might would actually approach Azuku about a particular offer from his old master. This would of course interest Azuku. His name was apparently Gran Torino, and his training was so tough that it made even All Might quiver, even to this day, which made Azuku seriously wonder what kind of training did this man give All Might. But he would immediately want to learn under Gran Torino, though. The kids would go through the process of selecting hero names, and Azuku would actually go with a pretty obvious name: the Arachnid hero, Spider-Man. It was kinda obvious, but while his classmates would remark that it had a nice ring to it. Azuku's next issue would be meeting up with Gran Torino. At first, Azuku would think the man was just senile, but learn it was all just a ruse. The old man was actually quite nimble for his age, capable of landing several hits onto Azuku. Azuku was able to dodge a few, but the agility Azuku had always been praised for was failing him now. During their training, Azuku would be forced to rely less on his vision and more on his other senses, such as his super hearing, in order to spot his opponent's next attack. He would of course start to learn echolocation as well. They would go patrolling from there on and end up in Hosu, where Gran Torino would be distracted, fighting off several Nomu. Azuku, he would end up hearing about Ida, who was apparently missing from a pro hero's line of sight, and he would actually end up remembering hearing about how the pro hero Ingenium was left out of commission by the hero killer Stain within this exact city. Azuku would have also remembered the fact that Ida was actually from a long line of pro heroes, the Ingenium family. Well, wasn't this just great? Azuku would decide to go web slinging in order to go find his friend Ida. He would eventually find Ida pinned down by the one known as Stain. Ida would tell Azuku to run away, but Azuku would mention how his mother always did complain about him being a terrible listener. And well, what kind of hero would run away from a person in need anyways? Azuku would rush in and do his best to fight off Stain. Stain would be surprised to witness how fast and agile Azuku was. Azuku would even use his webs at a certain point in in order to snatch Stain's weapons. Once Izuku got close enough to Stain, he would bury a couple of punches into the man, causing for Stain to cough up some blood. Izuku was holding back a little less here when it came onto his punches. He would have even used his talons in order to mic up some of Stain's body. Izuku would eventually lift up his mask before biting down on the fiend's arm. Stain's body would go numb right after, with Izuku explaining to Ida that he found out something a while back about his quirk, that being another aspect of a spider, and where he could release a non-lethal venom onto his opponents, which could actually paralyze them for a set amount of time. Sort of similar to Stain's quirk in a way, but it seemed that when it came on to Stain's quirk, there was some sort of limit to the time. Basically, it seemed to depend on blood typing for some reason. Izuku had no such issue. He basically found out about this ability of his in grade school when he just eventually bit down on some bullies. I don't even know. Basically, what ended up happening in grade school was that Izuku got into a fight. Real surprising. And he eventually just bit down on one of his adversaries at the time. Their body just refused to move from there on. They would have collapsed to the ground, incapable of moving. Of course, Izuku would get reprimanded later on, though, by the heroes and police alike. But Izuku would have just been glad to have saved his friend Ida from harm. Endeavor would be given credit for taking down Stain that day, and afterwards Ida would have gained more respect for Izuku. Todoroki, well, he wouldn't have been involved though, and he would still be rather distant to the boys. Once he made it back to school, the students would go through a training exercise in where they would try to get to All Might. It would be a rescue assignment of the sorts, and where the first to rescue All Might, they would end up winning. Basically, it was like whoever reached All Might's location first would win, but they would basically call it a rescue mission of the sorts. With the environment, Izuku would believe himself to have it in the bag. The only one capable of competing against him would be Zero, but his tape came from his elbows. Izuku's webs came from his wrists. Izuku could shoot out his substance faster because of that fact. Izuku would be the first one to reach All Might, with Zero not too far behind. This would only serve to see how much the students improved during their short time interning with pro heroes. What the students were to be really concerned with was their final exams. Class 1A would be facing off against the teachers, and Izuku would be paired up with Bakugo against All Might. Izuku, seeing the situation, would come up with a quick plan. Bakugo would serve as the distraction here. Bakugo would be the one to fight All Might to the best of his capability, while Izuku would go on to swing his way to the exit. Bakugo would question why Izuku wasn't going to fight All Might, wondering if Izuku was a coward or something, but Izuku would simply bring up the last two times that he had to fight Bakugo or just be in close proximity of the boy when using his quirk. Bakugo would hear Izuku reflect back on those situations and realize Izuku did have a point. He simply responded with fair point, and Bakugo would just go in to do his best in order to actually fight off All Might, or at least hold the giant off for a while. Izuku would silently web-sling his way to the exit. The two would pass in the end, and although not everyone passed the exams, they would still be heading up to the mountain lodge. only to find out that it was actually a boot camp. The first thing they would have to deal with was a bunch of dead monsters, so that Izuku would just nope out of there. He would shoot a web at the bus and make his way to the roof of the vehicle. Izuku would be the first of his class to make it to the mountaintop, and Azama would be annoyed about this. He would mention how it was impressive though that Izuku was able to just avoid the altercation in general. The rest of the class would end up reaching the same place as Izuku several hours later. They would see how Izuku seemed to be perfectly fine with not even a speck of dirt on his suit, nor exhaustion, and realize that Izuku basically abandoned them back there. So many of them were jealous of Izuku right now. They were envious, but that wouldn't last too long. What they really had to worry about was the next thing was, of course, their training from here on out. Asawa would basically ask Bakugo to throw a ball, and Bakugo would use this explosion. Everyone would be thinking that Bakugo would get an even higher score than back in the beginning of the school year, but Aizawa would end up finding out that Bakugo only improved by like 0.1 meters. Not even 0.1 meters, like 0.01 meters. And everybody would be shocked seeing this. They were shocked to see that Bakugo had improved so little in terms of the function of his quirk. Aizawa would simply respond with the fact that although the kids did end up improving the usage of their quirks, that did not necessarily matter in the long run because of the fact that their overall strength when it came onto the quirks did not improve by much. And so for the next days while they were at the mountain lodge, they would be working 10 times harder than usual in order to strengthen up their quirks. Izuku would be forced to shoot out as many webs as possible while aiming them in several different directions. He would also be required to swing from some of said webs. This was basically meant to improve the durability of his webs and the amount that he was able to shoot out at a time before it started to take negative effects on his body, due to the fact that, well, they were organic webs. As a way to distress from the day, the kids from class 1A and B would do a test of courage. On top of that, they would also be making curry. This was, of course, an important thing to note, due to the fact that, well, when it came on to some heroes, they would end up having to use the environment in order to make food, due to the fact that they would end up being on like some stakeout missions. They would be away from the cities. They wouldn't be able to just buy a simple meal from time to time, due to the nature of some of their missions. So learning how to cook was a necessity. Izuku would go to check on a little boy by the name of Kota. They were part of this group that were known as the Pussycats. They owned this mountain area after all, and Izuku was curious to know more about this boy. Izuku would end up finding the boy by himself at what seemed to be a cliff of the mountain. He would begin trying to communicate with him, but the boy would just tell him to leave. Right when Izuku was about to leave though, he would see a towering figure appear right in front of Kota, requesting to switch their mask for Kota's hat. Kota would have been a bit unnerved though, especially with how they were a cloaked figure. And the voice, they sounded familiar. He just couldn't put his finger on where there. He just couldn't tell from where. Where did he hear this voice from? He just found it to be way too familiar. Once the masked figure took off their, mask, Kota would freeze up. They would immediately recognize who this person was. It was hard to forget such a face. This was a person who killed his parents so many years ago. Izuku would realize how bad of a situation they were in once Muscular began using his quirk. Izuku would shoot a web at Kota when realizing that the boy was frozen in fear. He would pull the younger boy towards him, and they would flee the situation immediately. Izuku would find Ozawa, who would replace Muscular's quirk right after. They would knock out Muscular and deal with the rest of the villains in the area. Bakugo would get captured though. The villains had an interest in Bakugo, who was more violent in nature, and the fact he managed to get first place within the sports festival. This time around, Bakugo's rescue would be left up to the pro heroes solely. All Might wouldn't have passed on One For All at this point in time, so he would have had more fuel in the tank when using it to fight All For One. All Might would be forced to go into retirement right after though. With his retirement in full force now, Nezu would call Izuku into his office. Izuku would be confused until Nezu would explain the purpose for him being there. All Might would be there in his skinny form as well, and Izuku would question the validity of said statement. All Might would confirm it though, and even show Izuku his wound that All For One gave him so many years ago, basically like 9 or 10 now. Izuku would question if there were any other ways besides eating hair for him to receive One For All, and to that All Might would explain that Izuku needed to have some form of his DNA in order for One For All to pass on to him. Izuku would bring up how they could just do something like a blood transfusion or something. Just an exchanging of blood would be good enough, right? All Might would accept that he would end up accepting that option, and he would cut his thumb just enough for it to shed some blood. Izuku would do the same and they would connect thumbs. From there, Izuku could feel One For All practically flowing through his veins, and the world being even brighter than before. The next day, Izuku would be wearing heavy-duty shades, thanks to the fact that One For All basically enhanced his quirk's capabilities, meaning that even his hearing and vision got stronger. The students would practice creating special moves to build their marketability as heroes, and they would also prepare for the upcoming licensing exams with these special moves. Izuku would go to Hatsume and she would make sure to upgrade the shading on Izuku's costumes eyes. Considering the fact that Izuku did mention how his eyes had become even stronger than before. He would also think about getting some rocket boots and web wings. He figured that it could be good for gliding. Hatsume, hearing rocket boots, would appreciate that. She would have been all over that part. By the time of the licensing exam, Izuku would be ready. The first part of the exam would be in Izuku's favor thanks to his webs. He would be able to shoot webs at several balls and swing them at different opponents. He would end up being one of the first to pass the first half of the exam. As far as the second half went, he would do his best to rescue and calm down the fake civilians. He would lose points, sure, but he would focus his sole attention on rescuing the people. Izuku wouldn't be concerned with getting Orca. Izuku would pass the exam, and with that, the first thing Izuku would do would be to web swing across the city. After all, he did have a license now. Izuku would meet Mirio and proceed to have most of his class taken down just by the blonde-haired boy that looked somewhat like Tintin. Izuku would do his best in order to avoid Mirio's attacks and even try to swing a couple of punches at the older boy. Mirio would praise Izuku for his agility and perceptiveness in battle, but Izuku would still lose to the older boy in the end. At the very least, Izuku would have lost to one of the big three within UA, so that humiliation was a little less here. Izuku went trying to intern under Night Eye, but have to pass a test from him first. This test being to retrieve a stamp from him and stamp his own paper. Izuku would manage to retrieve the stamp, but he wouldn't be able to stamp his paper in time. Night Eye would stamp the paper though, impressed at how Izuku was able to avoid damaging the All Might memorabilia. Izuku would find himself as part of a rescue mission though afterwards. It would be to rescue a little girl from an organization known as the Yakuza. She was apparently being used for experimentations, her blood more specifically to create quick erasing bullets. This would deeply upset Izuku and Mirio, especially with the fact that they could have saved her back then when they were patrolling and they ended up encountering her. Mirio would regret telling Izuku to just let it go back then, because they just let it go back into the hands of some wild villain. Izuku would make sure not to hold back here. Izuku would find himself fighting Rappa during the raid, and he would knock the man out almost immediately. He wasn't playing games here. He would continue fighting off more individuals within the Yakuza, deeply injuring some of them and even breaking some of their bones, breaking some parts of their body, some irreversible parts as well. Mirio would face off against Overhaul with Izuku not too far behind. The two would end up taking out Overhaul together, and they would save Eri. The school festival would go off without a hitch. Izuku would take down Gentle and Labrava with ease. He would also give Eri a dance and get them a caramel apple. She would finally have a real smile that day. The two hero courses would end up seeing how much they improved, though, when fighting each other one day. It would have been a joint exercise, and Izuku would find his most difficult opponents to be Monoma and Shinso during his match. Izuku would have lucked out finding out that Monoma needed to touch. Well, when it came on to Monoma, he needed to touch somebody's hair in order for him to copy their quirk. Izuku's hero costume covered his body from head to toe, so it would be more difficult for Monoma to copy his quirk unless he managed to get a hold of his mask. Shinso, he would be forced to keep his mouth shut against in that matchup. He would slip up at one point though, but One For All would save him in the end. Izuku would from there go on to learn under Endeavor alongside Todoroki and Bakugo. When Izuku saw that Todoroki was still unwilling to use his fire, Izuku would finally convince him to start using it. Izuku would explain to Todoroki that within his eyes, it just seemed like he was refusing to accept a part of himself, which couldn't be well for his mental health later on. Whichever sort of trauma that Todoroki had gone through as a child, or maybe when he was older, he didn't really know Todoroki's situation all that well. He would suggest going to a psychiatrist or just getting some therapy in order to find some inner peace. As a hero, he could not afford to only be putting up half the amount of effort as everybody else. It could serve to be quite a bit of a detriment later on. Izuku would just go on to learn more about how to fight and how to harness his strength better. And as the years would go on from there, Izuku would discover more about One For All, the different quirks within it. He would also go on to defeat the likes of All For One and Shigaraki. Izuku would have lost quite a few people when it came on to that fight, but in the end he'll be able to successfully establish a new and less corrupt hero society, with him becoming the #1 hero, and he would have ended up marrying Ochako. Well, either Ochako or Momo, since I asked Neptune and they said like within the story it didn't really seem like there was much of an interaction between Ochako and Deku, and it seemed more like when the personalities, it would seemingly be more towards like a Deku and Momo ship. So it's pretty much whatever. Like, you guys let me know in the comments what ship you guys probably would have seen for this, what if, like with the way it was going, and basically like with the children that they end up having in this. Let me know like what sort of quirks the children would end up having, and of course with the fact that Deku did have one for all, he would eventually end up dying though, within his mid-30s, so at the very least. So Deku would have left a legacy though for his children and many others who aspired to be like him. So you guys let me know in the comments what sort of quirks you kind of see the children having, whether or not Deku would end up passing one for all onto them or onto somebody else. Who knows, maybe a quirk this kid for all we know. And just comment down below what you guys think. Anyways, like, if you guys like the video, if you guys like the video, you may as well just like it, and just if you like my content in general, you may as well hit the subscribe button and hit that notification bell in order to get notified whenever I do upload another video. Share the video as well to your friends and family, those who are interested in this sort of content. And yeah, that's all I have to say now. It is your boy King X signing out. Peace.